So I've got a little script here. As we embark on the first day of the Like Me Conference 2022, I have the pleasure of introducing our first keynote speaker, Anil Arora, the Chief Statistician of Canada. Mr. Arora is an experienced senior public official serving in policy and regulatory roles at various departments and agencies of the Government of Canada, such as Natural Resources Canada and Health Canada. He was appointed Chief Statistician of Canada in September 2016, and with over 25 years of experience with the agency, has led significant programs and transformations through the social, economic, environmental landscape, and much more. He's also led substantive international initiatives working with the United Nations and OECD. As Mr. Arora kicks off Climate Day, we look forward to hearing the trends and stories that data can tell us. And Anil, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thanks so much for your patience while the technology was sorted out. And please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Arthur. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Oh, wonderful. My goodness, 20 minutes of trying to get through technical issues can feel like an eternity, let me tell you. And just first of all, let me just say I appreciate everybody's patience. I've been on the other side, and I know it can be very, very frustrating. So good day, everybody, and thank you very much for that warm welcome, Arthur. It is really a pleasure to be able to share a few thoughts with you today from the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, the first people to walk the lands on which the national capital is located today. It is really an honor to be invited to share a few thoughts on what's happening in our country as the climate changes and how we can use geo-enabled data to monitor its impacts and plans for our collective future. À la demande des organisateurs de l'événement, je m'adresserai à vous en anglais cet après-midi, mais je serai toutefois heureux de répondre à vos questions en français, même après la session si c'est nécessaire. I'd like to start with some facts that might be obvious to some of you, but perhaps not. I know that some of my colleagues, I think, are going to put up some slides, and I hope you're able to see them and kind of walk along here a little bit with my short talk. Canada, as you all know, is the second largest country in the world. We have some of the world's largest forests, tundra, prairie wetlands, and freshwater ecosystems. In fact, more than a third of our country is forest, another quarter is Arctic tundra. But only about 9% of our landscape has been directly touched by people, modified in some respect for our benefit, such as for agriculture or for forestry. And here's, to me anyways, an astonishing fact. As of 2015, just 0.6% of Canada's land area was built up with cities, roads, and other infrastructure for human settlement. That means that the majority of us live and work on a fraction of a percent of our land. The rest is wilderness, most of it untamed. If something happens in the vast expanse of uninhabited territory, you can bet it will have an enormous impact on all of us tiny humans scattered in different pockets and clustered pretty close to the Canada-US border. And of course, something is happening. The climate is changing in some respects at rates higher than what even scientists have been predicting. Allow me to give you a 360-degree tour of some of the impacts of climate change on Canada's economy and society. So let me, firstly, temperatures are rising, not a surprise, I'm sure. Air temperatures are rising right across this country, but especially in the Northwest and especially in winter. In the regions between Yellowknife and the Yukon-Alaskan border, average winter temperatures have been rising by more than 5 degrees Celsius, by more than 6 degrees right up against that border. Even in the prairies, it's almost 4 degrees warmer in winter than it was just after the Second World War. And as the temperature goes up, the water cycle changes. We've seen changes in precipitation patterns right across the country, changes in how much water is stored in our environment, especially in the Northern Arctic. We're seeing, where obviously there's permafrost, snow, glaciers, and ice caps. The minimum Arctic sea ice area has fallen by almost 1/5 from the 1980s to the last decade. The temperature of our oceans surrounding Canada has changed too, especially off our east coast, where it's gone up by more than 1 degree. And that impacts the land what lives in the oceans, and people who make their living harvesting the seas. The fishing and seafood sector is an important source of income for 150 coastal communities, the majority of which are on the East Coast. In 2019, fewer than a third of the fish and marine mammal stocks were managed to be deemed healthy. Another almost 1/3 were assessed as cautious or critical. You can bet that affects our livelihoods too. Ocean warming has cascading effects on coastal communities, not only on local fisheries and tourism, but also because it affects sea level through thermal expansion and erosion. Warmer waters also create more intense storms. So climate change affects our economy, our society, and our health. And that includes our mental health as well. Take air quality, for example. You've probably heard its well-established associations with respiratory and cardiovascular problems. A study that we did performed with Health Canada in 2020 suggested air pollution might have additional links with psychological distress, and climate change can worsen air quality and intensify these problems. And these are just some of the climate change changes that we witnessed in Canada over recent times. And we're, of course, seeing extreme climate events happen more frequently now, and those are having cascading impacts as well. For example, last November, a major rain event occurred in British Columbia, causing substantial flooding, 6 to 8 inches over just a few days in the southwestern parts of the province. Meteorologists called it an atmospheric river. The flooding appears to have directly affected areas that account for almost 1% of British Columbia's GDP in 2018. And that, might not sound that much, but even just the small area around Abbotsford and Chilliwack is an important part of the regional economy. And the flooding caused a major shock to British Columbia's agricultural industry. Then, of course, there's the Fort McMurray wildfires back in 2016, just about the right time that we were taking a census, of course. Only 70,000 people live in this area, but among them are almost 1/6 of our national workforce in the oil and gas extraction industry. It took 2 months to get that wildfire under control. Close to 6,000 square kilometers of land were burnt. And that's about the size of Prince Edward Island. Almost 1 in 10 private dwellings in this area were completely destroyed. The town's power grid was damaged, and the area remained under a boil water advisory for months. The Fort McMurray wildfire was the most expensive natural disaster in Canadian history, and not just for insurance providers. It dragged down our exports of energy products. It dragged down the country's real GDP. And it has had lasting impacts on how our country views our resiliency to looming climate-related threats to our way of life. That brings me to why, of course, why this talk today is so relevant. I don't want to just give you the bad news. I want to tell you what we can do about it by working together. Canadians have good reasons to be increasingly concerned, of course, about the risks that climate change poses. But environmental research tends to be piecemeal and ad hoc. Studies are often done and then dropped. These studies are high quality and following the scientific method, but they need to be brought together with standardized accounting, statistical practices, so that the yield data that are in fact consistent and comparable across both time and space. And I would say Statistics Canada is well placed to offer that bird's eye view on the climate crisis. We gather a broad range of data on all the pieces and have the statistical infrastructure and integration capacity to help put these data sources together to paint that comprehensive picture for Canadians, such as what I've tried to do here today with the maps and data points that I see kind of flipping on the screens here. We can also send you this presentation later on, so not to worry. These data will guide, I think, crucial decisions by policymakers and businesses and by Indigenous and other communities. Our agency is also trying to help Canadians understand climate change and its impacts through different lenses, social, economic, and environmental. The world is getting more complex. It's no longer enough to look at any one aspect in isolation. We need to integrate data from different areas, the overlapping issues, if we're going to derive meaningful, actionable insights from them, especially where cumulative effects are, in fact, compounding some of these issues and challenges. I think it's essential to first understand the impacts of climate change. The information will help all of us find the right responses to it, whether that's adaptation or measuring sustainability and resilience. But then, of course, we need metrics to assess the effectiveness of these responses. And I think Statistics Canada is happy to work with partners to provide this type of information. And these data and analysis on ecosystem condition and services are needed at all geographical scales. We need to know what's happening locally, regionally, nationally, and of course, globally. Climate change is impacting the Northwest of Canada in different ways than on the East Coast, as I've tried to illustrate. And I believe location intelligence is crucial to understanding all these issues and navigating our way forward. We already know it's critical during extreme climate events when our disaster management partners must have urgent access to geospecific statistics and insights. So let me look at some city level examples of how climate analysis meets location intelligence. We recently compared satellite imagery from 2001, 2011, and 2019 to estimate greenness in Canadian cities, which is the presence and health of vegetation, such as that seen in parks, along tree-lined streets, in backyards, and lawns. We discovered that about 3/4 of large and medium-sized cities were less green in 2019 than they had been just 20 years back. Kelowna, British Columbia, for example, went from nearly 3/4 green to less than half. So did Milton, Ontario, and so did Winnipeg. But Saskatoon and Regina actually became greener. We can look backwards to investigate the causes of these changes: urbanization, some of the policies that are made, drought, insect infestations, and the like. And we can look forward at these implications as well. Having more trees in cities reduces energy use and air pollutants. Having fewer trees can cause what's known as heat islands, or bubbles of high temperature that envelop cities, which can intensify health problems like respiratory failure and heart stroke and lead to death. British Columbia experienced these problems during their other extreme climate event last year, the heat dome, that claimed 569 lives in June and in July. So there's a social dimension to greenness that's not talked about as much as I think we should. We find that in Canadian urban areas, residential greenness was unequally distributed. There are lower amounts around areas where people with lower incomes live, where recent immigrants, tenants, and most members of groups designated as visible minorities live. Governments can help mitigate climate-related problems once they have these types of data. And they can make our urban forests healthier and more resilient. And they can enact laws promoting planting vegetation along streets, in yards, and on top of buildings, for example. And of course, this is where Statistics Canada will do further studies to help cities monitor whether their policies are having the desired effect and what potentially could be some of the unanticipated impacts. We're compiling other information on communities as well. The depth and breadth of our data allows for greater integration and analysis of the various facets of our urban fabric, from green spaces and climate change adaptation to transit, social programs, municipal services, and more. We collect and share a broad range of data on public infrastructure. We can tell you what's happening in wastewater and drinking water. We provide transportation data that help urban planners and other stakeholders with climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. And with our geo-enabled data, we help individual Canadians decide where to even live. Our proximity measures data viewer is a tool, I hope you can see that on the screen, that allows people to see spatial relationships between themselves and their surrounding services and amenities and plan accordingly. But of course, we can't do this all alone. Data and support for our work come from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Natural Resources Canada, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, and Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, and Environment and Climate Change Canada, and of course, many other sources. We collaborate with many government departments and of course other stakeholders to report on climate change issues. And we're combining our expertise on location intelligence and artificial intelligence with that of other federal departments to do even more and do it more effectively. So we see our role not just as a data provider, but really as a convener as well, and an enabler, bringing together partners from government, the private sector, academia, and civil society to share information with each other. And as the government of Canada develops its whole of government integrated climate lens, I think we'll provide ongoing data, analytical services, and insights and expertise to support this very, very important and timely initiative. So how are we pulling all these data together? As I mentioned before, when you have large amounts of environmental data from different sources and you want them to be comparable and interoperable, you need to follow good statistical standards. And for that, we have the United Nations System of Environmental Economic Account Framework, or SEA. And the ecosystem accounting standard for SEA takes a spatial approach to accounting by organizing existing data on the location and the size of ecosystem assets, tracking changes in their condition over time, estimating ecosystem services, and linking this information to economic and other human activity. So pulling it all together with location intelligence, I think, is absolutely crucial. Ecosystem accounts will be the foundation of Statistics Canada's new Census of the Environment program, a first in the world, which seeks to paint an inclusive picture of our country, starting with the extent of different types of ecosystems, measures of their condition, and ending with an analysis of the contributions these areas make to the economy and our society. And it will leverage location intelligence to deliver a wide range of regional-based information. This program will be developed over a period of several years, of course. New releases such as tables, articles, tools, interfaces will be released incrementally through an online portal as more data becomes available to all of us. The Census of the Environment supports our commitment to protecting Canadians and our vast resources from the adverse effects of climate change. It will provide the statistical and the spatial framework necessary to help track our performance towards meeting international goals to protecting the planet and achieving a more sustainable future. And our first release, in fact, came last month with the report on human activity and the environment for 2021 and accounting for ecosystem change in Canada. And this report delivers the latest statistics on the extent and condition of our country's ecosystems. It discusses the influences of climate change, as well as estimates the supply and use of selected ecosystem services. The Census of the Environment supports the government's commitments to protecting Canadians and our vast resources from adverse effects of climate change. And I think it will provide the statistical and spatial framework that's going to be needed to help track our performance towards meeting those international goals, again, to protect our planet and achieve a more sustainable future. As we work towards these goals, we have important data gaps to fill, as you can imagine. We need to get a fuller picture of our country's ecosystem if we're going to help those suffering disproportionately from the effects of climate change. It's already having a profound impact on Indigenous communities. We talked about coastal communities, and especially those in the north. Indigenous peoples are uniquely tied to the environment. Their long cultural heritage puts them at greater risk to climate change related changes. Changes such as melting permafrost and sea ice, varying water cycles, floods, erosions, forests, and peatland fires. They've suffered damage to key services and infrastructure as a result of these changes. But we also know that data gaps exist, and we're committed to filling these gaps, and some of those will come from location intelligence and Earth observation data. So we aim to provide a fuller picture of climate change's health impacts and energy costs, and how to promote sustainable development that balances environmental, economic, and social well-being. And as we develop these initiatives to collect more detailed and complete information, we plan to work in partnership with Indigenous communities, respecting, of course, their data sovereignty and their priorities. So we're working to address other substantial data gaps and limitations in our program as well. Ocean data, of course, are sparse. We need more data on marine characteristics, species, and conditions. The runoff map in this slide shows areas in the north where we rely on much older studies to fill in for missing data. And the table on the bottom shows the time series that stopped in 2000 because water monitoring stations were closed in the north. We also need more comparable and consistent data. While the picture of our agriculture and urban ecosystems is more mature, national data on wetlands, grasslands, and freshwater areas, I think, fall way short. And time series data are even more scarce. Changing temperature in our freshwater ecosystems is one of the most important effects of climate change in Canada, and yet I would say we seriously lack water temperature data. The value of services coming from our ecosystems are also, not well understood or captured in our current accounts. We don't know the water quality benefits coming from our wetlands. Finer resolution ecosystem data that are nationally comparable are not readily available, and regional data is, as you can imagine, often difficult to integrate. And so this makes it really challenging to track the health of our ecosystems across the country. And that is really what the Census of the Environment is designed to do, is to reduce these gaps through collaboration with other departments, with the private sector, with other levels of government to compile a detailed national register of our different ecosystems. So looking ahead, we're looking to you, to others, to help us paint that well-rounded picture of our ecosystem assets and the impacts of climate change on every part of our country, our economy, and our society. And we know that working together will serve, I think, a greater good. We're always looking for opportunities to collaborate with everybody, with departments, NGOs, academia, businesses, so that we can get higher quality data to inform our research and our decisions that we make together. I'd say, Statistics Canada is a world-leading infrastructure, and I think this is key to bringing people and data together. But I think the linchpin there is, of course, public trust in the agency. We're always vigilant when it comes to keeping data safe, maintaining privacy, and of course, we operate in a transparent manner. We know that the data sources and information needs continue to evolve, and many of them have sensitivities. So we'll continue to integrate more location intelligence, climate change considerations into our day-to-day operations using more advanced analytic tools, and of course, the tools that protect confidentiality and privacy in tandem. So in turn, I think this will help deepen our understanding of the country's climate-related needs, and it'll help us prioritize them to serve Canadians. I think we then need to put metrics to our ecosystems and the impacts of climate change on government services in order to help build business cases for better policies. And I think data can inform decisions that will have tangible results for all of us. Better data drive better outcomes for all Canadians in the land, water, and the life around us. So with that, I thank you for inviting me and sharing with you what we're doing and some of the exciting things that we're doing in the future. And I turn it back to you, Arthur. And once again, I guess some apologies for some of the technical difficulties, but back to you. Thank you.
There we go. Sorry. See, I knew I was eventually going to do that. I was going to start talking on mute. Now, I've finally got it right here. I pushed all the right buttons. Yeah, thanks so much, Anil. That was a brilliant presentation. Kicked off the conference beautifully. And don't worry about the technology. We all run into those things every now and then. We do have actually some questions, Anil. I don't think you can see these, so I will read them out to you. And I have a few questions as well that I've got set aside here. We have a question from Phil Gratton. Hi, Anil. Always great to hear you speak. How successful would you say StatsCan has been in helping Canadians, not politicians or public servants, understand the impact of climate change? Are you getting any feedback directly from everyday Canadians? And I can read the second one if we lose track of it in the conversation.
Okay, well thank you, Phil, for that question. And of course, look, I want to make a distinction here. We take great pride in saying that we are Canada's statistical agency, not just Ottawa's statistical agency. So our aim is to make sure that anything that we do is publicly accessible, publicly available. It's there on the website. And we are starting to get more and more traction, I think, on a much broader audience that is seeing the value of the data and the insights that we produce. But also, I think more importantly, they see us as a partner to work with us, because I always say data is a team sport. More and more, we don't have the monopoly on on data. And I think the new and emerging sources of data provide really, really important opportunities. And I think we need to build this spirit in this country of contributing to the public good. It is something that I think is going to be key in making sure that we have the data that then respond to the broader set of needs that Canadians have. And that's what allows us to be able to serve the broadest needs of Canadians, whether you're in one of those small cities and need the data for local planning, or whether you're an NGO or whether you're advocating for more resources. I think having that consistent base of information and having it location sensitive, I think, is key. Because as I've tried to explain here, the average doesn't really help you much, right? You need to know what's going on, in a particular area, and you need to know what's happening in a particular sector. So I think we are seeing, changes. We are seeing positive feedback, and we're seeing more constructive partnerships. So thanks for that, Phil. I hope that answers your question.
Good answer. Thank you for that, Anil, and thank you, Phil. Now, I saw Richard Brath have his hand up, but I don't quite know how to pick him up. So somebody maybe can tell me how to get something across to Richard. In the meantime, I have a question here from Charles Mondello. Hey, Charlie. His question is, great presentation, thank you. How do you see remote sensing technologies and data augmented the data sets you use? That makes sense?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks, Charlie. Yeah, look, remote sensing data, from my time at Natural Resources Canada, is really, really crucial. I think, the more we can start to integrate data sets, I think, we get a much richer understanding of what's going on the surface, subsurface. We're starting to see the implications. Of course, the heat transfers are different depending upon the strata that you're in. So I think it is only by starting to pull together different sources of data that we can ask the right questions, in my mind, because I don't even know if we have all the right questions yet. Second, of course, is how do you standardize these data sets in a way that they make sense? So interoperability is really, really key. And it's only when you start to say, here's the problem, what are the data sets that can kind of help us understand some of those problems, that we start to create the environment for people to dig into those data sources and see the true value that's resident within it. And I think remote sensing data is a key part of that puzzle that we're going to have to come to grips with. So I hope that helps, Charlie. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. That was a good question. Now, we did track down Richard. So thanks, Richard, for putting it into the Q&A. Richard's question is a bit of a curly one. How much is AI used in the extraction and analysis of data from these diverse data sources? And do they raise questions regarding biases in models and explainability?
Oh, wow. What a great question. Thanks for that, Richard. First of all, I would say we're at Statistics Canada anyways, we're at the infancy when it comes to starting to use AI to start to understand what are some of the patterns and try to, codify them and replicate them and start to make sense of what we're seeing. So I think we are very, very close to the beginning of this. And of course, it doesn't matter which set it is, right? Whether it's an economic set or whether it's a social set, there are biases inherent in the data that we rely on and feed into those models. We are starting to get at better information, the metadata around it, the paradata around it, greater documentation, and I mean, as you know, right, most of the the effort is in understanding the data and cleansing it so that it gets to the point where we make you can't maybe completely remove the bias, but if you can understand them, you can intelligently use them, right? And so I would say it's not a sequential thing, but I think it's a parallel thing. We're going to have to get some of those data sets to be good enough, understand their strengths and their limitations, obviously leverage, the power of AI, have good frameworks around it, and make sure that people who are consuming it understand the extent that we've got to, but also that there are, some unknowns. I think that's kind of how knowledge kind of builds on itself. And so I think, as I said, we're dipping our toes into this, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to use it wisely. But as again, it's not the AI, it's not the algorithm per se, it's the data, and I think we have to understand it really, really well, so that we don't exacerbate biases and limitations of data. Frankly, I think we need to put a lot more emphasis on just better understanding the data before we just go, okay, AI is going to take care of it. It's not going to take care of it. In many cases, it's just going to exacerbate some of those problems that we see in the data. And that's why I think statistics and statistical expertise is really important to bring to understanding those new data sets, and as I said, some of the strengths and the limitations of it. Hopefully that helps, Charlie. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, thanks very much, Anil. Got one more.
Richard, sorry,
question.
Richard.
That's okay. That's okay. Richard will answer to Charlie for a moment or two, and he'll be good. Got a question from Steve Adler, who, by the way, is the next speaker. And his question is, does the environmental census include biodiversity census? And if so, how far back does the biodiversity census go? And for reference, Anil, Steve is an expert in ocean data.
Well, so thank you for that. And I think that is a question for some of our experts to dig into, frankly. It isn't, how far back do we go? Do we exploit the census that's there? Obviously, that's what we're trying to do, right? Is to get the ecosystem accounting so we can understand its true value. And then, people can sort of make decisions about, what is the value of exploitation or adaptation or whatever it is, as opposed to not. So getting that inherent value of that ecosystem is crucial to figuring out, what that time series is. But I think I'm happy to kind of, have that conversation and, take a few examples and sort of go back into a little bit more detail on that and get some of our technical experts involved in that. So thanks for that.
Thank you, Anil, and thanks, Steve. And we'll be talking to you in just a moment. Let me invoke chair privilege and sneak in one of my questions here. And Anil, I apologize, I didn't get a chance to throw this one to you before, but
that's okay.
It occurred to me out of your presentation. So one of the things I think is interesting here is with respect to climate change is the change, measure, improve cycle. And I'm just wondering a little bit whether Stats Canada has thought through, what does it look like now with respect to the metrics? And now we make a small change and we measure it again, and then we make a small change and we measure it again, and so forth. Are we well adapted for that?
That is exactly, I think the need and the strategy is to establish a good baseline of, where things are. Now, of course, we can, to the extent the data allow, go back and, as I mentioned in a couple of cases, go back and see the change that we've seen and look at, what potentially were the correlating factors. And that's exactly what we want to do, is to establish that baseline and then say, okay, what are the, and that's where I think we need to have that collaboration so we can better understand what are those triggers or things that are changing the ecosystem, so that we can show the clearest link between, whether it was planning, whether it was resource exploitation, whether it was leaving an ecosystem alone, and then seeing, okay, what were the impacts in the broadest sense, right? So we want to look at economic, social, health, and other factors that we bring to it. So that's exactly the approach that we're taking, Arthur.
Brilliant. Well, Anil, I think we can pause it there. So thank you so much for your presentation, and thanks for your patience with the technology, and especially I think provoked some really useful and interesting questions I think folks will go away from this thinking a little differently about how we might approach this. So it's brilliant.
Thank you.
So I don't know whether I'm supposed to pause the session or end the session here, but I will pause it. Lots and lots of thumbs up there. Thank you, everybody. And Anil will invite you to stay on if you can, and if not, well, that's okay. We'll connect with you. All right. So I think, yeah, Anil is off the stage. Cool. So I think I'm supposed to pause the session here while we get Steve lined up for the. So please take a short break. We'll only be a couple of minutes getting Steve online and continue the conversation. Thanks, everybody.